there's no situation without hope, and there's no place without helpers. And sometimes the helpers are harder to see. And I wanted to create a space where we could highlight those helpers, especially those helpers that are harder to see.
My name is Alex Lewis, and you're listening to Words Matter, a podcast by Car Window Poetry. Every other Thursday, we invite you to hear from someone who's using words to make the world a better place. Today, I'm chatting with Branden Harvey. He's a celebrator of good news, founder of Good and the Good newspaper, and host of the Sounds Good podcast. You can expect a lot of good today. I'm really excited for you to hear Branden's story, so without further ado, let's jump into it. Here's my conversation with Branden Harvey. All right. I am here with my friend Branden Harvey. Branden, welcome to the show.
Alex, thank you so much for having me. I'm just honored to be here. This is so fun.
Dude, absolutely. So, Branden, there are probably a number of people who are listening to this who have heard of you or they've heard me talk about you, but there are probably some people who this is their first time getting to interact with you, even if it's just hearing your voice. And so, Branden, who are you?
Who am I? Oh, wow. Ultimately, what I love to say is that I'm a storyteller focused on the good in the world. And for a long time, I thought that the ways that I was supposed to tell stories was through photography, or that it was like, oh, well, the way I'm supposed to tell stories is through video or maybe through social media. Now I'm realizing that maybe I can tell stories in all kinds of ways and hopefully move the needle for good.
Cool. I've heard you in different interviews and conversations kind of talk about how, photography was sort of the start of your creative work, but I'm sure there were moments in your childhood or your upbringing that you look back at and you say, wow, that's kind of crazy that happened. And now I'm doing this. I can see the connection between those things. So are there different moments or different highlights that you can look back on from your childhood and say, that moment really shaped me. Like I can see the clear line there.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm trying to think about like childhood versus, because I've got an immediate response for high school, which is when I first started photography. I remember that I was putting my work out into the world. I was putting it online, and I was hoping and praying that I would have some sort of opportunity to get to do this professionally, to get to actually have clients and to do photography work and to actually use my photography, outside of just the classroom. And there was one day where I got this phone call from this, young fashion designer who was releasing, a small line. And she was like, hey, I need a photographer to shoot essentially the lookbook for this. And my initial reaction was, oh, you've got the wrong number. Like I am not the right person for this. Do you know how young I am? Like I just had this freak out, and it was this weird tension of wanting to do this thing so badly, but also feeling so unqualified and so almost unwilling to like take that risk.
Yeah.
And so I actually told her no. Like I hung up that phone call and said like, like this ain't happening.
Yeah.
And it wasn't for a few more minutes that until I realized that this was what I wanted. And I ended up like kind of begrudgingly calling this person back and being like, hey, like I know you probably don't want me and I suck. But if you do actually, then maybe I could do the shoot for you, and I was able to do that shoot. And that was the very first time that I like took a risk. I did something that I didn't feel qualified for, but I spent the next month until the shoot preparing, working so hard. And the thing about that risk was that it's almost contagious, and so I started looking for more things where I was like, oh, well, this is way outside my comfort zone. Like, why don't I try this new adventure? Why don't I try this other thing that makes me feel uncomfortable? And so I think that feels like the beginning of this trajectory for me was that shoot that ended up going surprisingly well, and it felt great afterwards. But that initial like freak out, that was terrifying.
Yeah. Was there a moment, either while you were a photographer or, even earlier than that or after, where you first realized I'm not just this, but I'm actually a storyteller?
Yeah, I think for me that was because I started doing photography years before Instagram came along, and Instagram came out, or at least I got an iPhone when I had just moved to Portland, Oregon. And I was so fascinated by this new city that I was living in. I'd grown up in this small, conservative, tiny town. It was a college town. It was essentially the exact opposite of everything that Portland is. And I love it. It's such a great town. But Portland was so fascinating for me because I was having this exact opposite experience of everything that I'd ever experienced. And I was just enthralled by everything. Like, I'd go out my door and I would meet people that I'd never met before. And I would look out my window and see sights that I had never seen before. And everything just felt so new and fresh. And so I was trying to communicate this story through Instagram, but specifically through photography. And there's photographers absolutely who can tell a story, through just photography. You go to a museum and you're like, this tells a huge story. And then you look at like the little plate next to the art piece or the photo, and it's just like 3 words. And you're like, okay, wow. Okay. But for me, I was immediately drawn to starting to use my words, or starting to use multiple Instagram photos over the course of a week. And it was a really interesting challenge for me, because I really was trying to communicate the story of what I was experiencing. And I just started using new tools to do it, and finding all the tools that were available on the platform that I was on at the time. And I think that might have been kind of this moment where I was like, oh, well, I've got some other stuff. Like, I like to write. I like to shoot some video. I like to use social media. I like, and the list kind of continued to grow as I started to realize that it was okay to go outside those boundaries of what I thought that I was allowed to do.
Yeah. And I think what's fascinating about a lot of storytellers that I talk to, or people who would refer to themselves as storytellers, is that there isn't necessarily you don't necessarily feel tied down to a specific platform. You may start out doing one thing and feel really connected to that, but you're a storyteller. So what you're going to do, regardless of where you are, is tell stories. And I think what's super interesting about the jump that you made is you kind of took this photography experience that you had and telling stories on Instagram to then jumping over to this kind of weird, just, who knows what this thing called Snapchat. And kind of talk about like that realization of like, hey, Snapchat is a place where I can tell stories and where I can engage with people in this unique way.
Yeah. It's so funny because for the longest time, I totally dismissed Snapchat as just this like terrible, awful thing. Mm-hmm. I remember downloading it at one point and then the next day deleting it, just being like, oh, I don't need this in my life. And then I started following a friend who was using Snapchat to tell really interesting stories every day. Because for the most part, Snapchat was like, here's one thing I did, here's another thing I did, here's another thing I did. It was so fragmented. It was just kind of like, a little bit of a video throughout your day. Mm-hmm. And this friend was being really intentional about creating narratives across, he had character structures, and he had, plots, and he had a beginning, middle, and end, and a conflict, climax, resolution. He had the whole deal. And I was like, oh, this is interesting. And so I didn't jump onto Snapchat for any other reason than to personally challenge myself in a new creative endeavor. I thought, every day I'm just going to go out and I'm going to tell one story. And it doesn't have to be the best story. It just has to be a story. And I just thought that it would be a new way to kind of frame my mind. For me, when I got an iPhone, I started using my camera on my phone to practice framing so that I could shoot, better photos on my real camera. And then when I started using Snapchat, I was almost thinking, oh, well, this will help me practice my story structure so I can shoot real films. Yeah. And the fascinating thing is that I just started to fall in love with the medium. You don't have to do any editing. You get instant feedback. and every 24 hours the clock resets and you've got nothing. And any like followers that you gained in that last 24 hours, they don't know a single thing about you. And so you've got to reintroduce who you are, where you're at, but also in an interesting way that keeps the story alive for everybody else. And it was a really, really fun process. Like, I don't even pretend to say that it was like this huge thing that has a huge impact on the world. It was just this ultimate creative challenge, and it led down some wild paths.
I'm sure. So let's get into some of those wild paths. What are some stories that you look back on and say, like, dang, that's crazy that like I got to do that, or that I got to experience that? Are there stories from a lot of the time that you spent with Snapchat that stand out to you?
Yeah. I mean, so on kind of a small level, I would say that the first thing that it did for me was I work in a small space usually. Like, I am a freelancer who does most of his work on the internet. You know, I tell most of my stories online. So I sit at a desk and I write, or I edit, or I post, or I communicate. And that's what I do for most of my time. And especially when I was living in Portland, I was double dipping as a student and as somebody who was traveling the world telling stories. And so I spent a lot of time at my desk, but because I knew that I had to make a story every single day, it would pull me outside of that, and it would give me this opportunity to have some sort of wild experience every single day. And it was always something crazy, whether it was like, I'm going to like time myself to run down the street and get a burrito and try to do it in under, 60 seconds, something like wild. Yeah. Or it's like, oh, there's like a Santa marathon going through town right now. I'm going to go join them. It's these things that were wild. But I think that me starting to say yes to that on a daily basis led to me getting to say yes to some other wild opportunities. I got invited by essentially an agency working on behalf of the Vatican to cover the Pope's visit to the United States. So cool. And right then thereafter, I got invited to the White House under Obama, and I ended up being the first person to ever make a Snapchat story inside the White House. And I even got to head up to Malibu, the amazing Young Life camp up in Canada, and have an incredible experience, documenting this place that was deeply meaningful to me. All these things are so incredible and amazing. And it was fun getting to figure out, like, okay, these are huge deals for me. These are things that mean a lot to me. How can I tell this story in the most impactful way possible?
Yeah. And because I feel like when you're put into a situation of that nature, where you're starting to do things that are far from the norm, that aren't necessarily in your regular pattern of the day, that you begin learning things. There are different things that may come as new to you or that you haven't realized before. So what did a lot of those experiences teach you?
I would say one of them is that I learned something about myself. Ultimately, it was that although I'm super social and super outgoing, it's still like so tricky for me to just like go up to a stranger and have a conversation, or go up to a stranger and do something wild on the internet, And I think that this actually brought me out of my shell a little bit. I think that was a really fascinating thing. But also, I don't know. I think that I learned that, I don't know, because if you think about it, and sorry that I'm speaking in terms of social media here, but on Instagram, everything is supposed to be this big fancy deal. It's like you want to post the ultimate mountain photo, or the ultimate waterfall photo, or the ultimate like holding hands with your bae photo. Like you want to have all of these incredible moments that you put up online. But Snapchat, it's all about these little nuanced moments, these tiny experiences that make up your day. And so, I would while I was kind of growing on Snapchat, I got in this pretty ridiculous car accident where my car spun around and all this stuff happened, and I ended up being fine. It was the other person's fault. And so I ended up getting like sweet trips to the chiropractor every single week for free. And it's annoying and it sucks to like have to go and be like, okay, like let's go work on fixing my back for a while. But I started to learn how to turn that little moment in the day that could be an inconvenience into something that is an adventure and an experience, and something joyful and fun. And, I don't use Snapchat as much as I used to anymore, but I still really try to, turn those little moments in my day into something that is experiential and fun and exciting, not for others, but for myself, because life can be that way if you choose to look at it that way.
Mm. And Branden, what I think is really beautiful about your story and the different experiences that you've had is that in a lot of ways, it's a number of different online interactions that are leading to deeper offline relationships or a deeper impact that's able to manifest itself in the real world. And one of those places is in your relationship with your wife, Sammy. And so I'd love to hear, and for our audience to hear a little bit of that story of how, a simple online interaction was able to ultimately lead to a life together.
Yeah, it's so funny because I met my wife on Twitter, and for a while when I would tell people that, people were so weirded out. They're like, what in the world? And now everybody meets their partners online, I feel like.
Yeah.
And the thing that I'm most excited about is that one day it's going to be like, hey, I met my wife on MySpace, or I met my wife on Friendster. Like this ultimately meaningful interaction, like one of the most meaningful things that has ever happened in my life will be this thing where people are like, like that thing that Donald Trump used to use to make the world a terrible place. That's where you met your wife. Cool. And so, but it was really cool. My wife and I, somewhere along the line, we found each other on Twitter. I think that I saw somebody retweet her. I thought she was cute. I was like, I'm going to follow this girl. And then she followed me back. And then I apparently forgot who she was or got bored with her or something because I unfollowed her. Not maliciously, just like I didn't know who she was really. Yeah. And years went by, and somehow we got reconnected. She reached out and we started talking. I was like, this girl's amazing. Who's this? And I followed her again as if like nothing had ever happened. And we just started talking back and forth, and she was about to move to Europe. And so I was like, well, I got to make my move. Like I've seen Lizzie McGuire movie. I know that like she's going to go out there. She's going to meet Paolo. And I'm the Gordo in this situation, and I want her to end up with me. And so I said, hey, can we Skype? And so we start Skyping back and forth while she's in Rome and in Paris and all these places. And it was remarkable because we went months of just talking all the time, but never having met in person. And then when she was coming back to the States, I was like, hey, can I buy a plane ticket to come out and see you? And she was like, okay. And so I ended up doing that. And then we just kept on buying plane tickets for year after year after year after year. And now we're married today because of Twitter and plane tickets.
So crazy. I love that. It's funny. Like my girlfriend and I, we went to school together, but how our relationship really started was just like texting back and forth. Like, I think I just like reached out over, like a Christmas break or something. And then we haven't stopped talking since. And so
that's amazing.
I always think it's funny to like hear those stories of, just a simple online interaction that can lead to something deeper. And when I think about that in other areas, one of the places where I've gotten to really see that manifest in my own life is with your podcast, Sounds Good. These conversations that are happening, in people's ears, but the impact that those conversations can have, whether to empower somebody to go out and do something, as it was in my case, or to inspire somebody to live a different life or whatever that looks like. How did the idea for Sounds Good come about? And ultimately, what was the story you were seeking to tell through that podcast?
Man, I'm so honored by that. The process of creating Sounds Good has been one of my favorite things in the entire world. And honestly, I'm a pretty non-committal person. Like I'm very much somebody who jumps from thing to thing to thing. And so Sounds Good is the thing that I've had the longest commitment to outside of personal relationships in my entire life. The fact that we do 50 episodes a year has been remarkable to me. So it's so fun to bring that to the world. But ultimately, I decided to pursue creating Sounds Good because I was just super curious. there were these people in the world that I looked up to and admired so deeply, who they were rejecting cynicism in a way that I had never seen before. And ultimately, they were living these joy-filled lives that also made a difference. And I've always kind of noticed that there's two ways that you can respond to bad news in the world. The first is that you can kind of pretend that it doesn't exist, and you can kind of live this ignorance is bliss lifestyle. And honestly, most of my life growing up, that was kind of how I lived my life. When tragedy would happen, I would just kind of make a joke to dismiss it, or kind of tune out or opt out. And then the other kind of person, the other kind of way to react to bad news is to become jaded and cynical and angry about it because you dive in too deep. And honestly, maybe that's the direction that I started heading a few years ago, in the midst of just seeing so much injustice in the world and so much heartbreak and so much pain. And yet I was seeing these people online who I admired. I was meeting these people around the world who had found potentially a third way, had found a way of rejecting cynicism while also staying engaged, not tuning out, like leaning in.
Yeah.
And I wanted to figure out how these people were doing that thing. And so ultimately that was the common theme. And I didn't even know how to put words to it at the beginning. Like I don't know, but I bet that if you listen to some of those first few episodes, which are still some of my favorites, my intro to the podcast probably doesn't even explain that, because I didn't know what I was searching for, but I knew there was something there. And so the process of the podcast has just been figuring out what's the common thread between all these people who I love and admire and want to become. And I think that we found it. And I think that, I think it's been a really fun process, and seeing how that manifests itself in all of these different people. And it also just feels like a club celebrating, all of these incredible people. And then all of our listeners get to join in and become that as well. And it's this beautiful thing. And it's, oh my gosh, I learn every single week. It's not like I've figured it all out and I'm like, okay, let's just keep on making this for new people. It's like, I feel like we could just keep on going deeper and deeper and deeper and start learning more and more and more. And so I don't know, man, it's been wild. It's been really fun. And I'm honored that you've been enjoying it.
It's been super good. And there are a lot of the episodes that I look back on and, have these just deep connections with because of either something I heard or something that I saw in my own life that I either wanted to go deeper into or, elevate above. And so I think it's really incredible, sort of that just curation of different voices. And through that, not going into that process disconnected, but being fully engaged, it's opened the door for what has ultimately become the Good Newsletter and then ultimately the Good Newspaper. And so you talk a little bit about sort of what that process has looked like, of stepping into this place of saying, hey, we want to deliver good news to you on a weekly basis, but also we want to put something in your hands that is going to inspire you as you go on.
Totally. Yeah. I think that was one of the things that we kind of realized as we were making the podcast, and maybe just seeing what was going on in the world at the time that we launched this. The political election was heating up and it felt really divisive. And I think that more and more people were becoming aware of the systemic oppression of people of color. And we were seeing this huge refugee crisis, the largest since World War II. And all of these things were just adding up. And I think a lot of us just didn't know what to do. And at the same time, I was having these conversations with people who were creating solutions to these problems. They were the ultimate people who were, the thought leaders or the activists or the world changers or the entrepreneurs who were, creating systemic change to these big problems. And I thought that we just needed to dive in and celebrate this more. And at that time, I had reread this amazing quote from one of my absolute heroes, Mr. Fred Rogers. And he said this. He said, when I was a boy and I would see scary things in the news, my mother would say to me, look for the helpers. You will always find people who are helping. And it's a beautiful quote because it's a reminder of something that I think that we have all maybe experienced, that there's no situation without hope, and there's no place without helpers. And sometimes the helpers are harder to see. And I wanted to create a space where we could highlight those helpers, especially those helpers that are harder to see. And so every single week we started sending out a good newsletter where we would say, hey, here's what's going on in the world this week that was good. Here's people creating solutions to problems. Here's people making an impact. Here's data on why the world is becoming a better place day after day. And we went through maybe like a year or so of that. And we thought, maybe it would be powerful if people could physically hold on to good news, if people could hold it in their hands and read it and maybe even give news to somebody else who needs good news, physically, tangibly holding it. And so we set out to actually create a real newspaper in 2017 called The Good Newspaper. And we launched it on Kickstarter, and I was really nervous. And when we launched it, people responded really well. And I was really honored by that. And I don't even know if honored is the right word. I would say that I was excited to find my people. I was excited to find these other people who were on board with this, because the newspaper, we didn't want it to be fluff. We didn't want it to be like, check out this cute puppy, or like, hey, did you see? We didn't even want to do like cheesy puff piece stories. We wanted to talk about, ultimately it's this phrase that I heard somebody on one of my podcasts use passively recently, and I wanted to, dive deeper into it. And I love it so much. It's this idea of real good versus feel good. And so it's so, I think it perfectly describes what we're trying to do. And ultimately we don't want people to end with that story. We want people to ultimately take that story and then run with it, to join in, to become a helper themselves. And so we create this actual newspaper, and you read it and you get to the bottom of the page and we say, hey, and here's how you can get involved. Here's how you can take action and be a part of this. And that's been the most fun thing for me, is seeing the stories of how people are doing that, seeing the stories of how people are leaning in and taking action in the places that they work or they operate, or, wherever their platform is, they're using that in a way that's unique to them.
So Branden, what do you believe, with all these things that we've kind of discussed throughout this conversation, the different places, the different risks that you've taken, the different places that you've stepped into, what do you believe is the power of words and stories?
I think ultimately, for me, in my experience, I love seeing the way that words and stories can be used to excite people, to say, this is the ultimate goal. This is where we're going. This is the ultimate trajectory we're trying to get to. And I think as a part of that, as a part of telling that story and using your words, you've got to say, but here's where we're at. This is where we want to be, but here's where we're at. And then the beautiful thing is that people get to live out their stories to fill in that gap. So as a storyteller, you get to say, oh, here's where we're at, and cast that vision for where we're going. And then people are so creative. People have such amazing imaginations, and we've all lived different lives. And so we've all got different components to our imagination. So it's wild seeing how people connect those dots in meaningful ways that are so unique to them. And so that's all I see the need for me to do with words, is to maybe say, here's what's possible. Can you help us get there? And just let people run free.
Well, Branden, I want to take a few seconds before we get into the final questions to honor you, just for how you're making the world a better place. I think that there's so much power to the words that you're sharing and the stories you're telling and the people that you're inviting to be a part of that. Ultimately, it's not something that can be done alone. And so I love that you're putting a community around this that ultimately is working towards a better future and what we believe is going to impact so many more lives. So Branden, thank you so much for just the life that you're living, bro.
Alex, that means a lot. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So final questions. First one, I want to tweak a little bit. Typically I ask, what is giving you life right now? But also want to acknowledge that we're in this world right now where so much is happening that doesn't always give us life. It doesn't always give us hope. And so more so want to ask a variation of that, which is, what is giving you hope right now?
Man, I think, I love getting specific. And so the thing that like this morning has been getting me really amped is there's this really interesting piece in the New York Times about the Crown Saudi Prince and or the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the way that he is creating fascinating reform in Saudi Arabia, and how that will probably have an amazing ripple effect through the Middle East. And I think ultimately it's going to save a lot of lives, and I think it's going to maybe, lead towards decreased war and better communication between countries. And as I was diving into that story this morning, it was just so exciting to learn about that and to see how this one person who's flawed and imperfect has found ways to use his ridiculous and bizarre and fascinating platform in the Middle East to start making small little changes here and there. And so I don't know if that's what you're going for, but that's what I started my day with was diving into that story. And the cool thing is that every day there's stories like that. And so I'm excited to just keep on seeing how that pans out. I know it's dorky, but it's what I'm into.
No, I think it speaks to who you are. You are not only a teller of good news, but a celebrator of good news. And so it's awesome to, I was especially excited to ask you that question because I know that is the world that you live in, is looking for good news, looking for the helpers. So
thanks, man.
Branden, I'm sure after this conversation, a lot of people are going to want to know, hey, where can we find out if this dude's speaking somewhere, where we can hang out with him, or just to see the different stories you're telling. So Branden, where can people go to follow along with you, the work you're doing, the life you're living? Yeah, all the things.
I'll just make it easy and say, just Google my name. It's spelled in your podcast app right here, right there. And then that'll lead you to my site or social media or whatever. I love connecting with people. Tell me, leave a comment and, tell me that you found me through Alex, because that makes me so happy. But then ultimately, our podcast is on Apple Podcasts. And so, check that out. And then the newspaper is at goodnewspaper.org. And I've got my whole company, which basically holds Sounds Good, and the Good Newsletter, and the Good Newspaper is called Good, Good, Good. So if you see that around the internet, say hi to us. Yeah, we're not hiding on the internet, so you can find us.
I love it, dude. Well, we'll definitely make sure that all those things are in the show notes for this episode. And Branden, once again, man, thank you for being on the show today.
Dude, thank you so much. This is so much fun. And I love what you're doing. I love the way that you're using words to, make an impact in people's lives, whether it's on people's windshields or in people's ears. So thank you so much for having me on the show.
Absolutely, man. We'll talk soon.
Today's episode was produced by me, Alex Lewis, and our awesome music was provided by Julius Tunstall. Check him out on Instagram at jtulius. That's JTULIUS. If you enjoyed today's episode, I encourage you to leave a 5-star rating and review on your Apple Podcast app. That's a major way more people can learn about the show and be impacted by these conversations. And I also encourage you to take a screenshot of you listening to this podcast and share it on your Instagram story. Together, let's prove that encouraging words and small acts of love can make a big difference in the lives of those around us. Until next time, you matter, you are enough. Remember these words when times get tough.